Okay, hello everyone. First of all, I'm Dr. Richard Hall. I'm the co-lecturer or a co-lecturer on the America in a Nutshell module, and this is my very first lecture for you as a cohort, and I'll be lecturing on the Native Americans of Pennsylvania. Okay, so if we look at the a bit of background information first of all, and discuss first European contact. Well, I should outline that first of all, before European settlement, Pennsylvania, of course, was inhabited by many Native American tribes. They, together with the many indigenous groups who inhabited what became British North America, are collectively called the Indians of the Northeast Woodlands. As you know, however, this body of tribes constituted a mere portion of the American Indian tribes who inhabited North America on the eve of English colonization. Indeed, approximately 1 million American Indians are said to have lived between the east coast of North America and the Mississippi River pre-1492, and that's out of a total of about 12 million who lived in the Americas as a whole before Columbus, and I put in speech marks here, discovered, he didn't of course discover, the New World in that year. The reason I say Columbus, of course, didn't discover the New World is because it was already settled by these Native American tribes. Now, European contact with what became the colony of Pennsylvania and its surrounding territories grew rapidly after 1492, and this had a devastating effect on native peoples, be that through war, displacement, disease, and so on, especially so in the longer term. The English from 1497, the French from 1524, the Spanish reaching North America perhaps by 1520, and the Dutch from 1609 all claimed extensive territories in North America. And I just want to provide a brief overview of this just to again build a little bit of contextual information for you. So English colonization of North America truly began in 1607 with the founding of their first permanent settlement on that continent, Jamestown, in that year. The English soon spread out from this base, and in 1608 English Captain John Smith visited the Susquehannock Indians in Pennsylvania, perhaps their first contact with the region. Other Europeans were looking for land too. In 1609, Henry Hudson sailed into Delaware Bay, thus giving the Dutch their first claim to that area. He was followed in 1610 by the Virginian Captain Samuel Argall, who visited Delaware Bay and named it for Lord de la Warr, who was the governor of Virginia. Dutch navigator Cornelius Jacobzoon May was provided a patent to explore the Delaware region more thoroughly, and Dutch trading posts were established up and down the Delaware Bay starting in 1620. The New Sweden Company was chartered around the early 17th century, and in 1638 established the colony of New Sweden at Fort Christina in what is today Wilmington, Delaware. In 1643, Governor Johann Prince arrived and built Fort Elfsborg and Fort New Gothenburg at Tinicum Island near today's Philadelphia Airport, of all places. And that marked the first permanent settlement by Europeans in Pennsylvania. And that's a colony, of course, we'll be returning to in the next lecture. We'll be discussing New Sweden next week. In 1655, Dutch troops under the command of Governor Peter Stuyvesant of New Amsterdam, later New York, took control of the Swedish colony and held it until the British seized control of New Amsterdam in 1664. The Duke of York, of course, led this effort. And the Duke would go on to grant two loyal friends, Sir George Carteret and Lord Berkeley of Stratton, this particular territory, as I say. Now, these newly acquired English territories included swathes of modern Pennsylvania, as it would become. King Charles II of England, who owed £16,000 to Admiral Sir William Penn, in 1681 granted what is today Pennsylvania to that admiral's son, also named William Penn. Penn at first wanted to name a large tract of the territory New Wales, incidentally. A Welsh member of England's Privy Council objected to this, so Penn called it Sylvania, which meant woods, and the king would change this name to Pennsylvania in honour of the admiral he felt had served him so well. But that's some of the first European contact with the region. But as I've said, human occupation of North America and Pennsylvania significantly predated European colonization. And this particular lecture then is concerned with those native groups who already inhabited the region and who had called it their home for thousands of years. After all, it was they who shaped pre-Columbian Pennsylvania, and it was they who would feel the sharp consequences of this, well, eventually multi-pronged European colonization of their lands. So, the native groups of Pennsylvania. Now, Pennsylvania's history of human habitation extends to thousands of years before the founding of the colony or Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It is believed that the first settlement of the Americas more generally occurred at least 15,000 years ago during the glacial period, though it is unclear when humans first entered the area known as Pennsylvania. However, the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, a key archaeological site today in Washington County, Pennsylvania, contains the earliest known signs of human activity in the region, and perhaps of all North America. Indeed, it contains the remains of a civilization that existed 10,000 years ago and possibly predated the Clovis culture. Now, by 1000 AD, and akin to many of the tribal groups who lived in northeastern North America, the indigenous populations of Pennsylvania had shifted from hunter-gathering and nomadic, semi-nomadic lifestyles, and had developed agricultural techniques and a mixed food economy, somewhat different to their earliest hunter-gatherer ancestors. This, however, had been a gradual process for them, spanning thousands of years. Now, please do note that when we refer to the Native Americans of any given region, we must be careful not to homogenize them. In reality, though historians refer to peoples living in the Northeast as Indians of the Northeast woodlands, further breaking this into categories such as Algonquin-speaking or Iroquois-speaking, the reality was that these language groups could include up to 300 dialects that were distinct enough to be incomprehensible to others from within the same tribal grouping. Indeed, within Pennsylvania, we can identify several main sub-tribes of the Iroquois or Algonquin language groups who made their homes in the region. And it's establishing who these peoples were. The Lenape, or Delaware, who called themselves Lenni Lenape, or real men, originally occupied the basin of the Delaware River and were the most important of several local tribes that spoke an Algonquin language. Incidentally, they would fight on the British side in the Revolutionary War much later on, and that was the losing side as it transpires, and today their descendants live on reservations in Oklahoma and Ontario. The Susquehannocks were another powerful Iroquoian-speaking tribe who lived along the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania and Maryland. Now, as they lived in Algonquin-speaking tribes' territory, they were often involved in many wars. European diseases brought over to America by settlers significantly weakened this particular tribe, and disease accompanied by the attacks of Marylanders, in other words, individuals from the English colony of Maryland that was established in 1634, and indeed via attacks from the Iroquois, these resulted in the destruction of the Susquehanna as a nation by 1675. Interestingly, a few of their descendants were actually amongst the Conestoga Indians who were massacred in 1763 in Lancaster County. The Shawnees were an important Algonquin-speaking tribe who came to Pennsylvania from the west in the 1690s. Some groups settled on the lower Susquehanna and others with the Munsees, who were a division of the Delaware who lived on the upper Delaware River. In the course of time, they moved to the Wyoming Valley and the Ohio Valley, where they joined the Shawnees. They would become allies of the French in the French and Indian War, and then later on they picked the British side in the American Revolution. Now, for the Shawnees, this would mean that in the 18th century they were almost constantly at war with settlers, and it, of course, took its toll on their numbers. Indeed, after 1794, they were settled on the Delaware, or near the Delaware, in Indiana, and their descendants now live out in Oklahoma. Another confederation this time was the Iroquois Confederacy, initially known as the Five Nations, later became the Six Nations. This particular group of Native Americans included tribes such as the Mohawks, Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, and Senecas. And it was after about 1723, actually, when the Tuscarora from the south were admitted to the Confederacy, and this is where they became, as I say, the Six Nations. The five original tribes, when first known to Europeans, actually held much of what is now New York State, from, broadly speaking, Lake Champlain to the Genesee River. From this central position, they gradually extended their power. The Iroquois acted as middlemen in the fur trade with the West Indian nations, or Western Indian nations, I should say, and as intermediaries they were very skilled in dealing with Europeans. As the largest single group of Native Americans in northeastern America, they gained significant influence over many Indian tribes stretching from the Illinois and Lake Michigan on the in the more central area of America, all the way across to the eastern seaboard. Now, during the colonial wars of the 17th and 18th centuries, their alliance, or in fact neutrality quite often, was eagerly sought by the French and the British, who coveted their aid because they were so powerful. And in exchange for Iroquois aid, the British and indeed the French would make promises of better trade terms, weaponry, and treaties, all designed to cement and expand their relationship with the Iroquois, and the Iroquois in turn saw this as an opportunity to extend their own influence. Now, the Seneca, the westernmost tribe, established villages on the upper Allegheny in the 1730s, moving towards our region of Pennsylvania, and small groups of Iroquois also scattered westward into the Ohio and became known as the Mingos. For much of the colonial period, the Iroquois treated other groups in Pennsylvania as vassals, and this caused a lot of friction with these tribes. During the later American Revolution, most of the Six Nations took the British side, but the Oneidas and many Tuscaroras were pro-American. General John Sullivan's expedition up the Susquehanna River and General Daniel Broadhead's expedition up the Allegheny River laid waste to many Iroquois villages and cornfields in 1779 and really disrupted their society. And after the American Revolution, many of the Iroquois moved to Canada, but some did manage to establish relatively peaceful relations with the United States. So those were the major Native American groups who lived in what became Pennsylvania. There were, of course, other tribes who cannot be identified with certainty that occupied Western Pennsylvania before Europeans arrived, but they were eliminated by wars and indeed by diseases in the 17th century. In fact, long before the Lenapes, the Shawnees and the Senecas began to move there. Now, we do know, just to tie off really this aspect of the lecture, we do know of the Eries, who were a great Iroquoian-speaking tribe who lived along the south shore of Lake Erie. They were present in the region, but unfortunately they were wiped out by the Iroquois in 1654. Likewise, the Mohicans, an Algonquin-speaking tribe related to the Mohicans of Connecticut, lived in the upper Hudson Valley of New York, but were driven out by pressure again from the Iroquois and by pressure from white settlers, and some of these joined the Lenapes then in the Wyoming Valley about 1730, with others settling in Massachusetts. If you look at the slide on the board, or certainly on the PowerPoint which has been uploaded to Blackboard, you can see other smaller groups which were present in the Pennsylvania region, and indeed those regions bordering what became the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. You could see you had the Saponi, who were a Siouan-speaking tribe, originally from Virginia and North Carolina. And of course there were the Wyandotte, the Chippewa, Mississaugas and Ottawas who inhabited western Pennsylvania at various different points. Okay, so a lot to take in a short period of time. There, but what I want you to see from this section of the lecture is that there was, at various points in Pennsylvania's history, a vast array of different Native American groups, cultures and dialects inhabiting the province, and they were drawn together, as I say, in this region at various eras in Pennsylvania's history. Now, all of these tribes had their own ambitions and goals, of course, and these did lead to conflicts with each other and later Europeans. And this in turn demonstrates the importance of understanding the plurality of those we call Native Americans. In other words, not just viewing them as a homogeneous people, but to understand that they were diverse and numerous different nations in and of their own right. Okay, so looking at the culture and religion that was to be found amongst these Indians of the northeast woodlands. The regional climate and natural resources that were available to Indian peoples living in pre-European Pennsylvania heavily influenced the culture adopted by native groups here and in the northeast more widely. From 1000 to 1500 AD, climate changes, migrations and perhaps conquests were interwoven with something that truly transformed cultures in the area, an agricultural revolution. Beans brought northward from Central America and North America's southwest was supplemented by improved varieties of old crops such as squashes and maize. Coupled with a warmer climate, these crops and the new manner I should say, in which they were cultivated drove a transformation in the way natives in the region lived. Though I should add that some historians have argued that in Pennsylvania the climate and topography limited some of these wider northeastern developments. Now, the different types of houses, shelters and homes created by indigenous tribes in the northeast depended on the materials that were available to them and whether the home was intended to be temporary or permanent. Many tribes in this region lived in towns which, because of intertribal warfare, were fortified by fencing that was reinforced by dirt. And the size of towns could vary from between 300 to 2,000 people and normally contained around 30 to 150 buildings. Now, the majority of houses to be found in our region were of the longhouse variety. Longhouses, as you might see from the PowerPoint, are large structures which were built with the materials available in the local environment. They could house multiple families, usually related as an extended family, I'd add, or they could house a single family with their livestock. Large longhouses could also be used for community gatherings or ceremonies. While the traditional structures were often dark, smoky and smelly, the design was, it's fair to say, practical, both in terms of physical and indeed the social aspects. All families in the longhouse were members of a single lineage traced through the female line. Women were allowed to own property, land, housing, tools and other tangible items within Native American societies in the Northeast region. Within what are known as matrilineal societies, women had considerable influence in tribal governance too, one prime example being the Iroquois Confederacy. This also meant that hereditary titles of male authority descended from the female line, from uncle to nephew rather than from father to son, in other words. Biological fathers therefore assumed a role akin to uncles in European patrilineal societies. In native tribes, or Native American tribes, uncles, in other words the mother's brother, were the principal male role models and disciplinarian for children. Beyond the longhouse, villages were divided into clans, and clans were family groups. And it was forbidden to marry someone from your own clan. When a man married, he joined his wife's clan. When children were born, they became members of their mother's clan. The clan mother headed each clan. Ultimately, various kin groups would be tied together by marriage, making tribal cohesiveness very important for those native groups who lived in our region. What we find, however, was that this clan system was an open one. If a clan member died in war, for example, a prisoner could be adopted to replace the lost kin. Adoption frequently involved the captive receiving the name of a deceased member of the captor's tribe, and receiving, of course, the deceased's social status, becoming a member of the family of the deceased person. Now, it must be added that children and teenage girls seem to have been adopted more readily than grown men, who were, of course, less pliable and therefore less likely to accept their adoption, at least in Indian eyes. So if we look at religion as well, now, like all other cultures, the Indian societies of North America hoped to enlist the aid of the supernatural in controlling the natural and social world, and each tribe had its own set of religious observances devoted to that aim. Individuals tried to woo or appease powerful spiritual entities with private prayers or sacrifices of valuable items, for example, tobacco, furs and food. However, when entire communities sought divine assistance to ensure, for example, a successful hunt or a good harvest or victory in warfare, they then called upon shamans, priests, and in fewer tribes, priestesses, whom they believed to have acquired supernatural powers through visions. Now, these uncommon abilities included predicting the future and influencing the weather, matters which were of vital interest to whole tribes. But shamans might also assist individuals by interpreting dreams and curing or causing outbreaks of witchcraft. Now, many key Indian religious beliefs and practices thus that bore broad but striking resemblances to those current among early modern Europeans, both Catholic and Protestant. These cultures too created or credited a creation story as set forth in Genesis, They venerated a creator god, dreaded a malicious subordinate deity, Lucifer, and looked forward to the individual soul's immortality in an afterlife superior in every respect to the here and now. They too perpetuated their deity with, or I should say respected or revered their deity with prayers and offerings, and relied upon a specially trained clergy to sustain their societies during periods of crisis. And remember also, the great majority of early modern Europeans feared witchcraft and pondered the meaning of their dreams. So in that respect, there are those similarities between the two religious traditions. Now, as I allude to, as important as it is to appreciate the affinities between the religious cultures of Indians and early modern Europeans and Euro-Americans, there were real differences that must be kept in mind. The most important is that Indians did not distinguish between the natural and the supernatural. On the contrary, Native Americans perceived the material and spiritual as a unified realm of being, a kind of extended kinship network. In their view, plants, animals and humans partook of divinity through their close connection with guardian spirits, a myriad of supernatural entities who imbued their natural kin with life and power. By contrast, Protestant and Catholic traditions were more inclined to emphasize the gulf that separated the pure spiritual beings in heaven, God, the angels and saints, from the sinful men and women who were mired in a profane world filled with temptation and evil. Okay, so looking at this idea of and reality of conflicting cultures between Europeans and Native Americans, something very much felt in what would become Pennsylvania too. Now, for those of you who may remember from last year's Early Modern World lecture, in which I covered broadly this particular theme, quite often conflict between Europeans and Native Americans could be traced to religious differences, but also significantly the failure, at least as contemporary Europeans saw it, of indigenous peoples to properly demarcate and own the land that they lived on. You might remember that Englishmen especially initially considered the natives savages principally upon these foundations. To justify their appropriation of Indian lands, the English would use the theories of dominium and imperium. As the Indians exercised communal property ownership, but not individual property ownership, they were considered to not exercise full dominion over the land. Secondly, though Englishmen especially accepted that Indian groups practiced self-government, they did not consider them to have properly constituted political authorities that governed clearly demarcated territories, akin to, in other words, nation states. So the theory went, Native Americans did not exercise full imperium over the land, according to English and certainly other European nation standards. Now, as we've seen, Native Americans did in fact practice agriculture, just not in ways that the English understood. In our region, natives practiced settled agriculture or horticulture. However, these American Indian communities were communal. Land, animals and crops belonged to whole villages. Individual private property ownership and the fencing off of family farmsteads was unknown in pre-conquest America. The English thus regarded the land that American Indians occupied as unused and therefore open to European settlement. According to English norms, agriculture was supposed to be practiced on settled, private and usually fenced off farms and estates. Anything other than that was not proper agriculture. It was not civilized, and it was in fact, according to the English mindset, savage. This is especially true of Englishmen. One of the principal purposes of government was the protection of private property, or of every man's right to life, liberty and property, in the words of the famous 17th century philosopher John Locke. So, the absence of private property ownership necessarily implied at least the partial absence of, or at least a deficiency in, government. The English therefore conceptualized Native American political authority and nationhood not merely as inferior, and the same, it should be added, could be said of other Europeans, but also inadequate in and of itself. Yes, American Indians had villages, tribes and nations, and indeed alliances. They did not, however, claim and govern what the English considered to be clearly demarcated political territories, at least in the fashion of European nations who had clear, if often disputed, borders with each other. So that would become the crux of the divisions, certainly in the early years, but also later on as well, between Europeans, but especially Englishmen and Native Americans. Now, at first, the English did attempt to assimilate Native Americans, in other words, to civilize them by making them Englishmen, and Protestantism was the key here. However, as native resistance grew and wars broke out between colonists and Indians, this hope eventually faded away. Conflict led to deaths, massacres and atrocities on both sides. Native groups were driven increasingly westward as racially derived prejudices, certainly from the 18th century and the mid-18th century, began to take hold at that time. In Pennsylvania, this, as Peter Silver has argued in his work Our Savage Neighbours, developed into a rhetoric of fear, as he called it, that would serve to incite the colony's diverse European populations to violence. Now, Silver would argue that it was only through the shared experience of fearing and hating Indians that Pennsylvanians of various European backgrounds became united under the ideal of religious and ethnic tolerance that has since defined what's supposed to be the best in American life. Do note, however, that it was the Europeans, according to this narrative, that became united. The Native Americans were excluded. All of that being said, one of the things we'll learn a bit more about later in this module is that Pennsylvania in particular, founded by the Pacifist Society of Friends, or Quakers as they're more commonly called, and led by the colony's proprietor William Penn, at least initially adopted a different approach to American Indian peoples. At first, Pennsylvania and its governing class did not participate in the land grabs that were associated with other English colonies, and enjoyed a more peaceful coexistence with local native tribes. The Quaker-dominated Pennsylvania Assembly, and think of this as an equivalent of the British House of Commons, contained so many pacifists that it even refused to raise armed bodies of soldiers for the region's own defence, and they actually relied upon Native American refugee tribesmen for this particular service to provide a defensive shield for Pennsylvania, as extraordinary as that sounds. Now, a letter William Penn entrusted to Thomas Home and addressed to the Indians in Pennsylvania, this before, remember, he had ever met them, summarised the initial approach he took, and indeed the approach many of his fellow Quakers adopted towards Native Americans. And in this letter, Penn said, "The great God, who is the power that made you and me, incline your hearts to righteousness, love and peace with one another, which I hope the great God will incline both you and me to do. I have already taken care that none of my people sell rum to make your people drunk. I am your loving friend, William Penn." This, as you can see, was addressed to the Native Americans of his region. This was a seemingly noble start, and by contemporary standards it was very enlightened. However, it did all change. As time progressed and the attractions of the Quaker colony became widespread knowledge in Europe, the province saw a large influx of other European peoples who did not share the Quakers' tolerant outlook. And we can see this, for example, in the 1737 walking purchase, which was a particularly shameful episode in Pennsylvania's history, and which cheated the Lenni-Lenape, the Delaware, out of significant ancestral holdings in eastern Pennsylvania. In short, colonial authorities had claimed that they'd found a lost treaty from 1686 which ceded a tract of Delaware tribal land between the fork of the Delaware and Lee rivers that extended as far as a man could walk in 1.5 days, which would normally equate to 40 miles. William Penn's son, Thomas Penn, 1702 to 1775, was at the time the proprietor of Pennsylvania, 1737. And what Thomas Penn did was that he hired the 3 fastest walkers in the colony, and then he offered them a large prize. And the largest prize, or the sole prize, would go to the person, one of his runners, or the runner, who could cover the most land. Now, the eventual winner, who was running on a clearly and carefully marked path, crossed more than twice the land the Delaware had anticipated, and it caused them to lose about 1,200 square miles of their territory. Now, to stitch things up further, at Thomas Penn's request, members of the Iroquois Confederacy, which technically had suzerainty over the Delaware, enforced this unpopular and unfair decision. And of course, in turn, that outraged the Lenni-Lenape, whose land had to all intents been stolen by a very clever subterfuge. So, when eventually wars broke out with the French, and especially the French and Indian War of the 1750s, many Native American peoples in the Pennsylvania region were reluctant to provide the defensive shield they once had for the colony Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. European and Pennsylvanian expansion, particularly in this and other British colonies, exacerbated the situation. The Lenni-Lenape and other tribes who'd been cheated by the walking purchase and other examples of English chicanery would side with the French during the French and Indian War and devastated through their raids frontier communities in Pennsylvania. And it was this that led to what Peter Silver has called the development of an anti-Indian sublime, which in turn saw native peoples subjected to racism and violence. And that marked, of course, a dramatic shift from the goals and policies of the early Quaker-dominated settlers. For the indigenous Americans, the results of this trend, this shift in trend, particularly in Pennsylvania, were disastrous and really equated to displacement and the loss of cherished homelands. Okay, that's the end of this particular lecture. I appreciate that these will be a lot to take in, and of course I might go through these online lectures a little bit more quickly than I would a face-to-face lecture, simply because I'm not stopping and asking you questions. But what I would say is, as you take your notes and as you think about these lectures, pause the recordings at various points, jot down a few notes, raise a few questions, research those questions. Of course, the lectures are going to be essential in you passing your online tests, so this is a process that you need to become familiar with. If you do have any specific questions or issues that you'd like to raise with regards any of the recordings I and Dr. Stevens give, please do let me know. And I would remind you as well that the contact details for myself and Dr. Stevens are available on Blackboard. Thank you very much for listening to the lecture, and I hope you've been able to grasp its direction and indeed its purpose.